I'm honored to have you here, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. Welcome to our channel, where today's focus is all about Battle of Appomattox Court House. Let's get started. The Battle of Appomattox Court House, fought in Appomattox County, Virginia, on the morning of April 9, 1865, was one of the last battles of the American Civil War. It was the final engagement of Confederate General-in-Chief Robert East Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia before they surrendered to the Union Army of the Potomac under the commanding general of the United States Army, Ulysses South Grant. Lee, having abandoned the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia after the 9.5-month siege of Petersburg and Richmond, retreated west, hoping to join his army with Confederate forces, the Army of Tennessee in North Carolina. Union infantry and cavalry forces under General Philip Sheridan pursued and cut off the Confederates' retreat at the central Virginia village of Appomattox Court House. Lee launched a last-ditch attack to break through the Union forces to his front, assuming the Union force consisted entirely of lightly armed cavalry. When he realized that the cavalry was now backed up by 2 corps of Federal infantry, he had no choice but to surrender, with his further avenue of retreat and escape now cut off. The signing of the surrender documents occurred in the parlor of the house owned by Wilmer McLean on the afternoon of April 9. On April 12, a formal ceremony of parade and the stacking of arms led by Confederate Maj. General John B. Gordon to Federal Brig. General Joshua Chamberlain marked the disbandment of the Army of Northern Virginia with the parole of its nearly 28,000 remaining officers and men, free to return home without their major weapons, but enabling men to take their horses and officers to retain their sidearms, swords, and pistols, and effectively ending the war in Virginia. This event triggered a series of subsequent surrenders across the South, in North Carolina, Alabama, and finally Shreveport, Louisiana, for the Trans-Mississippi Theater in the West by June, signaling the end of the 4-year-long war. As we embark on the next leg of our journey, let's unpack the layers of military situation and examine its core elements. The final campaign for Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederate States, began when the Union Army of the Potomac crossed the James River in June 1864. The armies under the command of Lieutenant General and General-in-Chief Ulysses South Grant laid siege to Petersburg, south of Richmond, intending to cut the 2 cities' supply lines and force the Confederates to evacuate. In the spring of 1865, Confederate States Army General Robert East Lee waited for an opportunity to leave the Petersburg lines, aware that the position was untenable, but Union troops made the first move. On April 1, 1865, Maj. General Philip Sheridan's cavalry turned Lee's flank at the Battle of Five Forks. The next day Grant's army achieved a decisive breakthrough, effectively ending the Petersburg siege. With supply railroad lines cut, Lee's men abandoned the trenches they had held for 10 months and evacuated on the night of April. Lee's first objective was to reassemble and supply his men at Appomattox Court House. His plan was to link up with General Joseph East Johnson's Army of Tennessee in North Carolina and go on the offensive after establishing defenses on the Roanoke River in southwest Virginia. When the troops arrived at Appomattox on April 4, however, they found no provisions. Lee sent wagons out to the surrounding country to forage, but as a result lost a day's worth of marching time. The army then headed west to Appomattox Station, where another supply train awaited him. Lee's army was now composed of the Cavalry Corps and 2 small infantry corps. En route to the station, on April 6 at Sailor's Creek, nearly 1/4 of the retreating Confederate army was cut off by Sheridan's cavalry and elements of the II and VI Corps. 2 Confederate divisions fought the VI Corps along the creek. The Confederates attacked but were driven back, and soon after the Union cavalry cut through the right of the Confederate lines. Most of the 7,700 Confederates were captured or surrendered, including Lieutenant General Richard South Ewell and 8 other general officers. The delay prevented Lee from reaching the Appomattox station until late afternoon on April 8, allowing Sheridan to reach the station ahead of the Southerners that evening, where he captured Lee's supplies and obstructed his path. Following the minor battles of Cumberland Church and High Bridge, on April 7, General Grant sent a note to Lee suggesting that it was time to surrender the Army of Northern Virginia. In a return note, Lee refused the request, but asked Grant what terms he had in mind. On April 8, Union cavalry under Brig. General and Brevet Match. General George Armstrong Custer captured and burned 3 supply trains waiting for Lee's army at the Appomattox station. Now both of the Federal forces, the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the James, were converging on Appomattox. With his supplies at Appomattox destroyed, Lee now looked west to the railway at Lynchburg, where more supplies awaited him. However, on the morning of April 8, a battalion of the 15th Pennsylvania Cavalry was detached from Stoneman's raid into North Carolina and southwestern Virginia and had made a demonstration to within 3 miles of Lynchburg, giving the appearance of being the vanguard of a much larger force. Despite this new threat, Lee apparently decided to try for Lynchburg anyway. While the Union Army was closing in on Lee, all that lay between Lee and Lynchburg was Union cavalry. Lee hoped to break through the cavalry before infantry arrived. He sent a note to Grant saying that he did not wish to surrender his army just yet but was willing to discuss how Grant's terms would affect the Confederacy. Grant, suffering from a throbbing headache, stated that it looks as if Lee still means to fight. The Union infantry was close, but the only unit near enough to support Sheridan's cavalry was Madge. General John Gibbon's XXIV Corps of the Army of the James. This corps traveled 30 miles in 21 hours to reach the cavalry. Madge. General Edward O. Celsius, Ord, commander of the Army of the James, arrived with the XXIV Corps around 4 a.m. while the V Corps of the Army of the Potomac was close behind. Sheridan deployed his 3 divisions of cavalry along a low ridge to the southwest of Appomattox Court House. Thumps interrupt Lee's retreat and Grant's pursuit in the final Appomattox campaign, April 1865. In the following section, we'll be immersing ourselves in the captivating world of battle. At dawn on April 9, 1865, the Confederate 2nd Corps under Madge. General John B. Gordon attacked Sheridan's cavalry and quickly forced back the first line under Brevet Brig. General Charles H. Smith. The next line, held by Brig. Gens. Ranald South. Mackenzie and George Crook slowed the Confederate advance. Gordon's troops charged through the Union lines and took the ridge, but as they reached the crest, they saw the entire Union XXIV Corps in line of battle with the Union V Corps to their right. Lee's cavalry saw these Union forces and immediately withdrew and rode off towards Lynchburg. Ord's troops began advancing against Gordon's corps while the Union II Corps began moving against Lieutenant General James Longstreet's corps to the northeast. Colonel Charles Venable of Lee's staff rode in at this time and asked for an assessment, and Gordon gave him a reply he knew Lee did not want to hear. "Tell General Lee I have fought my corps to a frazzle, and I fear I can do nothing unless I am heavily supported by Longstreet's corps." Upon hearing it, Lee finally stated the inevitable, "Then there is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths." Many of Lee's officers, including Longstreet, agreed that surrendering the army was the only option left. The only notable officer opposed to surrender was Longstreet's chief of artillery, Brig. General Edward Porter Alexander, who predicted that if Lee surrendered then every other Confederate army will follow suit. Lee decided to request a suspension of fighting while he sought to learn the terms of surrender Grant was proposing to offer. A white linen dish towel was used as a Confederate flag of truce and was carried by one of Longstreet's staff officers into the lines of General Custer, who was part of Sheridan's command. After a truce was arranged, Custer was escorted through the lines to meet Longstreet. According to Longstreet, Custer said, "In the name of General Sheridan, I demand the unconditional surrender of this army." Longstreet replied that he was not in command of the army, but if he were, he would not deal with messages from Sheridan. Custer responded that it would be a pity to have more blood upon the field, to which Longstreet suggested that the truce be respected, and then added, General Lee has gone to meet General Grant, and it is for them to determine the future of the armies. At 8 a.m., Lee rode out to meet Grant, accompanied by 3 of his aides. Grant received Lee's first letter on the morning of April 9 as he was traveling to meet Sheridan. Grant recalled his migraine seemed to disappear when he read Lee's letter, and he handed it to his assistant Rawlins to read aloud before composing his reply. Grant's response was remarkable in that it let the defeated Lee choose the place of his surrender. Lee received the reply within an hour and dispatched an aide, Charles Marshall, to find a suitable location for the occasion. Marshall scrutinized Appomattox Court House, a small village of roughly 20 buildings that served as a way station for travelers on the Richmond-Lynchburg stage road. Marshall rejected the first house he saw as too dilapidated, instead settling on the 1848 brick home of Wilmer McLean. McLean had lived near Manassas Junction during the First Battle of Bull Run and had retired to Appomattox to escape the war. The coincidence has been written of that farmer McLean, who relocated to avoid war after one of the Civil War's first battles happened on his land, would come to have the war's end negotiated in his sitting room. With gunshots still being heard on Gordon's front and Union skirmishers still advancing on Longstreet's front, Lee received a message from Grant. After several hours of correspondence between Grant and Lee, a ceasefire was enacted, and Grant received Lee's request to discuss surrender terms. Let's now shift gears and explore surrender through a critical lens, uncovering its strengths and weaknesses. Dressed in his ceremonial uniform, Lee waited for Grant to arrive. Grant, whose headache had ended when he received Lee's note, arrived at the McLean house in the mud-spattered uniform, a government-issue sack coat with trousers tucked into muddy boots, no sidearms, and with only his tarnished shoulder straps showing his rank. It was the first time the two men had seen each other face to face in almost 2 decades. Suddenly overcome with sadness, Grant found it hard to get to the point of the meeting, and instead the two generals briefly discussed their only previous encounter during the Mexican-American War. Lee brought their attention back to the issue at hand, and Grant offered the same terms he had before. The terms were as generous as Lee could hope for. His men would not be imprisoned or prosecuted for treason. Officers were allowed to keep their sidearms, horses, and personal baggage. In addition to his terms, Grant also allowed the defeated men to take home their horses and mules to carry out the spring planting, and provided Lee with a supply of food rations for his starving army. Lee said it would have a very happy effect among the men and do much toward reconciling the country. The terms of the surrender were recorded in a document handwritten by Grant's adjutant Eli South Parker, a Native American of the Seneca tribe, and completed around 4 p.m., April 9. Lee, upon discovering Parker to be a Seneca, remarked, "It is good to have one real American here." Parker replied, "Sir, we are all Americans." As Lee left the house and rode away, Grant's men began cheering in celebration, but Grant ordered an immediate stop. "I at once sent word, however, to have it stopped," he said. The Confederates were now our countrymen, and we did not want to exult over their downfall, he said. Custer and other Union officers purchased from McLean the furnishings of the room Lee and Grant met in as souvenirs, emptying it of furniture. Grant soon visited the Confederate army, and then he and Lee sat on the McLean home's porch and met with visitors such as Longstreet and George Pickett before the two men left for their capitals. On April 10, Lee gave his farewell address to his army. The same day a 6-man commission gathered to discuss a formal ceremony of surrender, even though no Confederate officer wished to go through with such an event. Brigadier General Brevet Major General Joshua L. Chamberlain was the Union officer selected to lead the ceremony. In his memoirs entitled The Passing of the Armies, Chamberlain reflected on what he witnessed on April 12, 1865, as the Army of Northern Virginia marched in to surrender their arms and their colors. Chamberlain's account has been questioned by historian William Marvel, who claims that few promoted their own legends more actively and successfully than he did. Marvel points out that Chamberlain in fact did not command the Federal surrender detail but only one of the brigades in General Joseph J. Bartlett's division, and that he did not mention any salute in his contemporary letters, but only in his memoirs written many decades later when most other eyewitnesses had already died. Confederate General John Brown Gordon, in command of the 2nd Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia, did recall there was a salute, and he cherished Chamberlain's act of saluting his surrendered army, calling Chamberlain one of the knightliest soldiers of the Federal Army. Gordon stated that Chamberlain called his troops into line, and as my men marched in front of them, the veterans in blue gave a soldierly salute to the vanquished heroes. This statement by Gordon contradicts Marvel's perception of the event. At the surrender ceremonies, about 28,000 Confederate soldiers passed by and stacked their arms. General Longstreet's account was 28,356 officers and men were surrendered and paroled. The Appomattox roster lists approximately 26,300 men who surrendered. This reference does not include the 7,700 who were captured at Sailor's Creek 3 days earlier, who were treated as prisoners of war. Get ready for a thought-provoking discussion as we delve into Aftermath and its impact on our understanding. While General George Meade, who was not present at the meeting, reportedly shouted that it's all over upon hearing the surrender was signed, roughly 175,000 Confederates remained in the field, but were mostly starving and disillusioned. Many of these were scattered throughout the South in garrisons or guerrilla bands, while the rest were concentrated in 3 major Confederate commands. Just as Porter Alexander had predicted, as news spread of Lee's surrender, other Confederate commanders realized that the strength of the Confederacy was gone and decided to lay down their own arms. General Joseph East, Johnston's army in North Carolina, the most threatening of the remaining Confederate armies, surrendered to match. General William T. Sherman at Bennett Place in Durham, North Carolina on April 26, 1865. The 89,270 Confederate troops who laid down their weapons, the largest surrender of the war, marked the virtual end of the conflict. General Richard Taylor surrendered his army, the departments of Alabama, Mississippi, and East Louisiana, at Citronelle, Alabama on May 4, 1865. President Jefferson Davis met with his Confederate cabinet for the last time on May 5, 1865 in Washington, Georgia, and officially dissolved the Confederate government. Davis and his wife Farina, along with their escort, were captured by Union forces on May 10 at Irwinville, Georgia. Upon hearing about Lee's surrender, General Nathan Bedford Forrest, future leader of the Ku Klux Klan, also surrendered, reading his farewell address on May 9, 1865 at Gainesville, Alabama. General Edmund Kirby Smith surrendered the Confederate Trans-Mississippi Department on June 2, 1865, in Galveston, Texas. Also on May 26, 1865, the Camp Napoleon Council of Native American Tribes, including a number that had sided with the Confederacy, met in Oklahoma and decided to have commissioners offer peace with the United States. Cherokee Chief and General Stand Watie, in command of 1st Cherokee Mounted Rifles, surrendered the last sizable organized Confederate force on June 23, 1865 in Choctaw County, Oklahoma. There were several more small battles after Lee's surrender. The Battle of Palmetto Ranch, east of Brownsville, Texas, on May 1865, is commonly regarded as the final land battle of the war, ironically a Confederate victory which was followed soon after by the surrender of the Confederate forces. Commander James Ivell Waddell, in command of the Acomas raider of the Confederate States Navy, was the last to surrender when he lowered the Confederate flag in Liverpool and surrendered his vessel to the British government on November 6, 1865. Waddell was halfway around the world in the Pacific when he learned the war had ended. Lee never forgot Grant's magnanimity during the surrender, and for the rest of his life would not tolerate an unkind word about Grant in his presence. Confederate General Longstreet spoke well of his old friend Grant, saying he was grateful to Grant for a cheerful greeting and providing him a cigar at Appomattox, as well as later efforts by Grant to get Longstreet a pardon and appointing him to a federal position in New Orleans after Grant became president. Likewise, General John Brown Gordon cherished Chamberlain's simple act of saluting his surrendered army, calling Chamberlain one of the knightliest soldiers of the Federal Army. The spotlight now falls on Civil War commemorative stamps as we delve deeper into its details. During the Civil War centennial, the United States Post Office issued 5 postage stamps commemorating the 100th anniversaries of famous battles, as they occurred over a 4-year period, beginning with the Battle of Fort Sumter Centennial issue of 1961. The Battle of Shiloh commemorative stamp was issued in 1962, the Battle of Gettysburg in 1963, the Battle of the Wilderness in 1964, and the Appomattox Centennial commemorative stamp in 1965. With the groundwork laid, let's now examine battlefield preservation and its connections to our previous discussions. The American Battlefield Trust and its battlefield land preservation partners have acquired and preserved 512 acres of the battlefield. Turning our focus to works cited, let's explore its key elements. Calkins, Chris. The Appomattox Campaign, March 29, April 9, 1865. Conshohocken, PA, Combined Books. At Chamberlain, Joshua L. The Passing of the Armies. An account of the final campaign of the Army of the Potomac. New York, Bantam Books, 1993. First published 1915 by G. P. Putnam's Sons of His, Burke. To Appomattox, 9 April Days, 1865. New York, Eastern Acorn Press reprint, 1981. First published New York, Reinhardt, Iker, David J. The Longest Night, A Military History of the Civil War. New York, Simon & Schuster, Iker, John H., and David J. Iker. Civil War High Commands. Stanford, CA, Stanford University Press, A. Freeman, Douglas South. R. East. Lee, A Biography. 4 vols. New York, Charles Scribner's Sons, A. Gordon, John B. Reminiscences of the Civil War. New York, Charles Scribner's Sons, A. Grant, Ulysses South. Personal Memoirs of U. South. Grant. 2 vols. Charles L. Webster and Company, A. Corn, Jerry, and the editors of Time Life Books. Pursuit to Appomattox, The Last Battles. Alexandria, VA, Time Life Books, 1987. Lee, Fitzhugh, General Lee, Great Commanders, D. Appleton and Company, Long, East. Be the Civil War Day by Day, an Almanac. Garden City, NY, Doubleday, Longstreet, James, From Manassas to Appomattox, Memoirs of the Civil War in America, J. B. Lippincott, A Marvel, William. A Place Called Appomattox. Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Press, A Marvel, William. Lee's Last Retreat. The Flight to Appomattox. Chapel Hill, the University of North Carolina Press, A Salmon, John South. The Official Virginia Civil War Battlefield Guide. Mechanicsburg, PA, Stackpole Books, A Silkenet, David. Raising the White Flag, How Surrender Defined the American Civil War. Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina Press, A Smith, Gene Edward. Grant. New York, Simon & Schuster, O. Winnick, J. April 1865, The Month That Saved America. New York, HarperCollins, 2006. First published A National Park Service Battle Summary Cusack Report Update. Your feedback helps me improve, so please take a moment to leave a comment or review.